Welcome back to Room 57, where we delve into the most chilling, disturbing, and complex criminal cases from around the world. Today, we take you to Canada, a place known for its peaceful nature, where a case of unimaginable brutality shocked the entire country. This is the case of the Shafia family murders, a tragedy that unfolded in Kingston, Ontario, and exposed deep divisions within a family torn apart by honor, tradition, and a dark desire for control. The Shafia family was a seemingly typical immigrant family, but behind closed doors, things were far from ordinary. The patriarch, Mohammad Shafia, and his wife Tooba, Mohammad Shafia, had come to Canada from Afghanistan seeking a better life. Along with their children, they tried to integrate into Canadian society, but their strict, traditional, and often extreme views about family honor clashed with the more liberal Canadian culture around them. What began as a normal family life soon spiraled into one of the most shocking murder cases in Canada's history. Mohammad and Tooba, along with their son, Maxwell Shafia, brutally murdered their three daughters Zainab, Simbalam Blas, Sahar, Tujublas, and Giati, 13, along with their father's first wife, Rona Amir Mohammed, in June 2009. The murders, carefully orchestrated and executed, were claimed to be an act of honor killing, a term that continues to spark debates about cultural clashes, family control, and personal autonomy. The case of the Shafia family murders grabbed national attention for its horrific brutality, but more so for the chilling motivations behind the crime. In this video, we will explore the complex web of lies, betrayal, and rage that led to this family's horrific downfall. From the disturbing discovery of the victims' bodies to the twisted motives of the killers, this case serves as a grim reminder of the destructive power of honor and the terrifying consequences of a patriarchal mindset. Part 1. The Shafia family. A look into their lives. Before the murders, the Shafia family's journey to Canada. Before the murders, the Shafia family had an ordinary immigrant story. Mohammad Shafia and his wife Tooba both arrived in Canada from Afghanistan, hoping to build a better future for their children. They settled in Kingston, Ontario, a small city known for its tranquility and beautiful landscapes. In many ways, the Shafia family seemed like a typical immigrant family, trying to adapt to life in Canada while holding on to their cultural and religious beliefs. However, as the years went on, cracks began to show in the family dynamic. Mohammad, a deeply conservative man, struggled to reconcile his traditional values with the more liberal Canadian culture surrounding him. His view of the world was shaped by a rigid, patriarchal mindset, and he believed strongly in the importance of family honor. Tooba, though more submissive, was in full agreement with her husband's beliefs, and together they instilled these values in their children. In particular, Mohammad and Tooba placed great importance on the idea of family honor, specifically the honor of their daughters. In their eyes, the girls' behavior and actions were a direct reflection of the family's standing in society. For them, any deviation from their expectations, such as seeking independence or pursuing relationships outside of their control, was seen as a betrayal of their honor. This mindset set the stage for a series of tragic events that would soon unfold. The daughters' struggle for independence. The Shafia girls Zainab, Sahar, and Giati had different ideas about their futures than what their parents envisioned. Raised in a strict, controlling household, the sisters longed for freedom, independence, and the opportunity to live their lives on their terms. As teenagers, they were beginning to experience the world outside of their family's rigid control. Zainab, the eldest daughter, was a vibrant young woman with dreams of becoming an independent person. Sahar, the second daughter, was rebellious and outspoken, often questioning her parents' authority. Giati, the youngest, struggled with feelings of isolation, as her life was dominated by the family's oppressive rules. The girls were often caught in the middle of an intense battle between their desire for freedom and their parents' unyielding expectations. They began to defy their parents' rules, sneaking around, making friends outside of the family, and pursuing relationships. Mohammad and Tooba viewed these actions as a direct attack on the family's honor, and as the girls became more vocal about their independence, The tension between them and their parents reached a boiling point. Maxwell Shafia, a son torn between family and his own beliefs. Maxwell Shafia, the Shafia's son, was a young man caught between two worlds. On one hand, he had grown up under his father's stern, patriarchal influence and was expected to follow in Muhammad's footsteps as the head of the family. On the other hand, Maxwell was in his early 20s, struggling to reconcile his own desires for independence with the pressure to uphold his family's strict values. Reports suggest that Maxwell was troubled by his family's authoritarian views and often had strained relationships with his parents, especially his father. However, Maxwell did not dare to speak out against the established norms. Like many sons in similar families, he felt trapped by his duty to preserve his family's honor. In this toxic environment, Maxwell began to harbor resentment against his sisters for their desire for freedom, and his anger toward them began to build over time. Maxwell's behavior was increasingly erratic. At times, he appeared to be deeply loyal to his parents, even helping them enforce their oppressive rules over his sisters. At other times, his frustration with the situation seemed to surface. In the months leading up to the murders, Maxwell's actions became more suspicious, and many friends and relatives began to worry about his state of mind. The building tension, a family on the edge. By the summer of 2009, the Shafia family was at a breaking point. Zainab, Sahar and Geeti had been openly defying their parents for some time, and their behavior had escalated. Zainab had secretly been seeing a boy, and her defiance was seen as a direct challenge to her father's authority. Sahar, the most rebellious of the three girls, had also been making plans to marry someone her parents didn't approve of. Geeti, the youngest, was beginning to rebel in subtle ways. Frustrated by her lack of freedom, as their defiance grew, so did the tension in the household. Muhammad and Tooba, determined to uphold their family's honor, became more authoritarian and controlling. Maxwell, caught in the middle, seemed to align with his parents' desire to control the girls. Despite his conflicting feelings, the family dynamic was fragile, and it was only a matter of time before the tension exploded into violence. The night of the murders on June 30, 2009, the Shafia family's nightmare unfolded. Zainab, Sahar, and Geeti, along with their father's first wife, Rona Amir Mohammed, were found dead in a submerged car in a canal. The police initially believed it was a tragic accident, but after further investigation, it became clear that the deaths were no accident. The girls had been deliberately killed, and the murder had been meticulously planned. The investigation into the Shafia family murders revealed the shocking truth. Muhammad, Tooba, and Maxwell had orchestrated the deaths of the four women in an attempt to restore the family's honor. Their actions were a horrific manifestation of the extreme measures some families will take when faced with perceived dishonor. Conclusion of Part 1. The Shafia family murders shocked the nation, but they also sparked an important conversation about cultural differences, family dynamics, and the concept of honor in today's world. As we move into the next part of the investigation, we will explore the details of the police investigation, the unraveling of the Shafia family's darkest secrets, and the chilling motivations behind this tragic crime. Stay with us as we continue to uncover the disturbing story of the Shafia family murders and the tragic consequences of rigid cultural expectations. Part 2. The Investigation. Unmasking the Shafia family's dark secret. As the news of the Shafia family's brutal murders spread across Canada, the police investigation quickly turned into one of the most high-profile and intense criminal inquiries in the country's history. Initially, the deaths of Zainab, Sahar, Geeti, and Rona Amir Mohammed seemed like a tragic accident. However, as investigators began to dig deeper into the circumstances surrounding the case, it became clear that the truth was far darker. The Shafia family's secret life was about to be exposed, revealing a twisted tale of control, honor, and murder. The initial investigation, a tragic discovery: the bodies of Zainab, Sahar, Geeti, and Rona were discovered in a submerged car at the bottom of the Rideau Canal in Kingston, Ontario, On June 30, 2009, the car, a Nissan Sentra, was found by a passerby who noticed it in the water near a popular tourist spot. The police were initially called in to investigate what appeared to be a tragic accident. When the bodies were recovered, it seemed like a tragic case of drowning. The car had been submerged in the canal, and the victims appeared to have died from water inhalation. However, there were immediate inconsistencies that raised suspicions. The position of the car in the water seemed deliberate. It wasn't an accidental crash into the canal. Instead, it appeared as though the car had been intentionally driven into the water. Further investigation revealed that the 4 victims had been bound and had signs of blunt force trauma, suggesting that this was no ordinary car accident. The police began to suspect foul play, and the case quickly turned from an accidental drowning to a homicide investigation. What was initially perceived as a tragedy was now unraveling into something far more sinister. The Shafia family's background, a pattern of control and isolation as the investigation intensified. The authorities began looking into the backgrounds of the victims and the family dynamics that might explain the crime. The Shafia family appeared to be a typical immigrant family. Mohammad Tooba, their children, and Rona, Mohammad's first wife. They had immigrated to Canada from Afghanistan, seeking a better life and new opportunities. However, behind closed doors, their strict adherence to traditional and patriarchal values set the stage for an explosive and deadly conflict. The Shafia family was ruled by Mohammad Shafia, a patriarch who had absolute control over his wife, children, and even his first wife. Rona Muhammad's worldview was deeply rooted in the concept of family honor, which he saw as a reflection of his control over his household. Tooba, his second wife, followed his strict rules and supported his authority, even as she contributed to maintaining the oppressive atmosphere in the home. The family's values were centered on the belief that women must adhere to traditional roles, and that any deviation from these roles brought shame to the family. The daughters, Zainab Sahar and Geeti, were caught between these two conflicting worlds. On one side, they were raised under the rigid rules and expectations of their father and mother. On the other, they were exposed to the freedoms and opportunities offered by Canadian society. As they grew older, they began to resist their family's oppressive control, seeking independence and forming relationships outside the confines of their parents' rules. The tension between the Shafia family's traditional views and the daughter's desire for independence became increasingly apparent. Zainab, the eldest, had been secretly seeing a man against her parents' wishes. Sahar, the second daughter, had been planning to marry someone they disapproved of. Geeti, the youngest, also felt the weight of her family's expectations pressing down on her, and her struggles to break free from her family's control were evident. The Shafia family's strict adherence to their traditional values left no room for the daughters to live as they wished, and this led to growing resentment and tension within the household. Maxwell, Shafia, a son torn between loyalty and rebellion. Shafia, the son of Mohammed and Tooba, was a pivotal figure in the Shafia family dynamic. Maxwell had grown up under his father's strict authority and had been taught to adhere to the same patriarchal values. However, unlike his sisters, Maxwell had not openly rebelled against his father's control. Instead, he found himself caught between loyalty to his family and the desire to break free from his father's expectations. Maxwell's relationship with his father was complicated. He often sought to please Mohammed, and at times, he supported his father's decisions. However, Maxwell also began to express frustration with his family's rigid values. This tension between his desire for independence and his loyalty to his father created a volatile situation within the Shafia household. Maxwell's behavior was erratic in the months leading up to the murders, as he seemed to be both complicit in the control of his sisters and, at times, sympathetic to their struggles. Maxwell's involvement in the murders remains one of the most disturbing aspects of this case. As the investigation progressed, it became clear that Maxwell had not only been aware of his sisters' defiance, but had actively participated in planning the horrific crime. His motivations seemed to stem from a deep resentment of his sisters' independence. as well as a desire to protect his family's honor in the eyes of his father. The investigation unfolds. The unmasking of the killers. As the investigation continued, the authorities began to gather evidence that pointed toward the Shafia family's involvement in the murders. The police questioned Mohammad, Tooba, and Maxwell, but at first, they maintained their innocence. However, it wasn't long before the cracks in their stories began to show. The first breakthrough came when police obtained the family's phone records, which revealed disturbing details about their behavior in the days leading up to the murders. Investigators discovered that Mohammad had been in constant communication with his son, Maxwell, and his wife, Tooba, discussing the fate of the girls and the dishonor they had brought upon the family. The records indicated that Mohammad had a clear desire to restore his family's honor, and he had discussed the solution with his family members in the days before the murders. In addition to the phone records, forensic evidence also began to emerge. Blood samples from the victims were found in the Shafia family's car, which further corroborated the theory that the deaths were not accidental. The authorities also discovered that Mohammad and Tooba had taken out insurance policies on the lives of their daughters, which raised further suspicions that the murders were premeditated. The turning point in the investigation came when Maxwell was arrested and questioned by the police. Initially, he denied any involvement in the murders. However, under intense pressure, Maxwell began to crack. He confessed to his role in the deaths of his sisters and his stepmother, revealing that the murders had been carefully planned as a way to restore the family's honor. Maxwell stated that his father had instructed him to help carry out the crime, and that he had played an active role in luring the victims into the car before it was driven into the canal. Maxwell's confession was the final piece of the puzzle that confirmed the Shafia family's involvement in the murders. The chilling reality of the crime was now clear. This was a calculated, cold-blooded act of violence, driven by a desire to preserve the family's honor at any cost. The arrests, Mohammad Tooba and Maxwell Shafia, charged with murdering August 2009, Mohammad Tooba and Maxwell Shafia were arrested and charged with the murders of Zainab, Sahar, Giyati, and Rona Amir Mohammed. The case quickly became a media sensation, with the public shocked by the brutality of the crime and the involvement of a family that had been well respected in their community. The charges against the Shafia family were severe: first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and the intentional killing of their daughters and Rona. The trial was set to begin in 2011, and the Shafia family's fate was now in the hands of the justice system. Conclusion of Part 2. The investigation into the Shafia family murders revealed a dark and twisted story of control, betrayal, and violence. The tragic deaths of Zainab, Sahar, Giti, and Rona were the result of a ruthless and calculated plan to restore the Shafia family's honor. As the case progressed, it became clear that the Shafia family's beliefs about honor and tradition had led to the tragic deaths of 4 innocent women. In Part 3, we will delve deeper into the trial of the Shafia family, examining the legal proceedings, the defense strategies, and the emotional testimony from those who were affected by this horrific crime. We will also explore the lasting impact this case has had on the conversation surrounding honor killings, patriarchy, and family dynamics in immigrant communities. Stay tuned as we continue to uncover the chilling details of the Shafia family murders and the search for justice for Zainab, Sahar Giyati, and Rona. Part 3. The trial of the Shafia family, a fight for justice. The Shafia family was arrested and charged with the brutal murders of Zainab, Sahar, Giti, and Rona Amir Mohammed. The case became a national sensation in Canada. It was not just the shocking nature of the murders that captivated the public, but the involvement of a family in the execution of such a horrific crime. The trial that followed was one of the most intense and closely watched legal proceedings in Canadian history, drawing attention to issues of family honor, patriarchy, and cultural clashes in immigrant communities. The legal proceedings, the case against the Shafia family in August 2009. Mohammad Tooba and Maxwell Shafia were formally charged with the murders of the 4 women. The prosecution quickly painted a chilling portrait of a family consumed by rigid, patriarchal values, willing to go to any lengths, including murder, to restore their family's honor. The case would unfold over several years, with the three accused facing multiple charges of first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and the deliberate killing of their daughters and Rona, who was Muhammad's first wife. The trial officially began in 2011, and it became apparent from the outset that the case would be highly complex, emotionally charged, and politically sensitive. The Shafia family's defense team faced a massive challenge: to argue that the murders were not premeditated, and that the killings could have been the result of a misunderstanding or accidental deaths. However, the overwhelming evidence of the family's involvement in the crime and the motivation behind it made this defense almost impossible to substantiate. The prosecution's case, a calculated and cold-blooded act, the prosecution presented an airtight case, focusing on the evidence that linked Mohammad, Tooba, and Maxwell to the murders, as well as their clear motives. One of the central pieces of evidence was Maxwell's confession, which came after he was confronted by police with phone records, witness testimonies, and physical evidence that contradicted his initial denials. His statement was chilling, revealing that the murders had been carefully planned and executed with precision. According to Maxwell's confession, he had lured his sisters and stepmother into the family's car, a Nissan Sentra, under the pretense of taking them for a drive. He and his father, Mohammed, had already discussed the plan to kill them, seeing them as a threat to the family's honor due to their defiant actions and behavior. Zainab's secret relationship, Saha's desire to marry someone outside the family's expectations, and Giddy's rebelliousness were all seen as breaches of the family's strict cultural and moral codes. In the Shafia family's eyes, these transgressions warranted violent punishment. Maxwell, who was supposed to be his sister's protector, had instead become complicit in their murder. His confession revealed the terrifying truth: the four victims had been murdered in cold blood, and their bodies were dismembered and discarded to cover up the crime. The brutality of the crime was underscored by the fact that the bodies were thrown into the Red Canal, a symbolic representation of the Shafia family's attempt to erase the shame they believed their daughters had brought upon them. The prosecution also presented forensic evidence that corroborated Maxwell's confession. DNA from the victims was found in the family's car, and blood traces were found at the Shafia residence. Surveillance footage captured the Shafia family near the canal at the time of the murders, which made it clear that the deaths were not accidental. The prosecution emphasized that the actions of Mohammed, Tooba, and Maxwell demonstrated a level of premeditation that could not be ignored. The defense's argument, a plea of mental instability in response to the overwhelming evidence. The defense team for the Shafia family sought to shift the blame and argue that the murders were not premeditated. They aimed to introduce the argument that Maxwell's confession was coerced, and that he had been manipulated by police into admitting guilt. The defense also sought to paint the Shafia family as victims of a cultural misunderstanding, arguing that the brutal actions were the result of misunderstandings between the family's traditional values and the liberal, secular environment they encountered in Canada. The defense team sought to emphasize the mental instability of the accused, particularly that of Mohammad Shafia. They argued that Mohammed had been under immense stress, as his family was increasingly alienated from him due to the daughter's rebellious behavior. They claimed that Mohammed's actions had been driven by a deep sense of betrayal and a desire to preserve his honor. The defense also tried to downplay Maxwell's role in the murder by suggesting that he was influenced by his father's authority and had acted out of a sense of familial duty, rather than any personal malice. Tooba Shafia's defense was particularly focused on portraying her as a woman who was merely following her husband's lead. They argued that Tooba had been a victim of Mohammed's control, and that she was under duress when she participated in the killings. Her defense sought to evoke sympathy, suggesting that she had been manipulated by her husband and had acted out of fear for her own safety. While these arguments were presented, they were far from convincing. The overwhelming nature of the evidence, the confessions, forensic evidence, and surveillance footage, little room for doubt. The defense's strategy seemed more like an attempt to confuse the jury and avoid the harshest penalties. Emotional testimonies the victims remembered throughout the trial. Emotional testimonies from Sod's family and friends painted a poignant picture of the young woman's life and the tragedy of her untimely death. The courtroom was filled with tears as loved ones remembered Zainab, Sahar, Geeti, and Rona as bright, compassionate women with futures full of promise. They had been daughters, sisters, and friends, full of hope and ambition, but their lives were violently cut short by the very people who were supposed to protect them. Family members spoke of their deep pain and the sense of betrayal they felt, knowing that their loved ones had been murdered by their own relatives. They described the impact of the murders on their community and how the brutal loss had left them forever scarred. The public mourning of the victims became a powerful reminder of the importance of supporting victims of family violence, particularly women who suffer under patriarchal systems. The prosecution used these testimonies to drive home the point that the victims were not just statistics, they were real people who had been robbed of their lives by their own family. The personal stories shared in the courtroom were meant to humanize the victims and underscore the extent of the Shafia family's cruelty. The verdict? A day of reckoning. After weeks of testimony and legal arguments, the trial of the Shafia family came to a close in January 2012. The jury deliberated for several days before reaching their verdict, and when the decision was finally read aloud, it sent shockwaves through the courtroom. The Shafia family was convicted of first-degree murder for the deaths of Zainab, Sahar, Geeti, and Rona. Mohammad Shafia, his wife Tooba, and their son Maxwell were all found guilty of the cold-blooded, premeditated murder of their daughters and stepmother. The court sentenced Mohammad and Tooba Shafia to life in prison without the possibility of parole, while Maxwell Shafia received a 25-year sentence for his role in the murders. For the victims' families, the conviction brought a measure of justice, but it was not a cure for their grief. The sentences handed down to the Shafia family were seen as a victory, but the pain of losing loved ones in such a horrific and senseless manner would linger forever. The broader impact of the case, the Shafia family murders, had far-reaching implications for both Canadian society and the global conversation about honor-based violence. The case brought attention to the dangers of patriarchal cultures that place family honor above the lives and rights of women. It sparked a national conversation about the intersection of culture, religion, and the law, and how these elements can sometimes perpetuate violence against women. Moreover, the case raised important questions about the treatment of immigrant communities in Canada and how cultural traditions can sometimes lead to tragic outcomes. In response to the Shafia murders, there was a renewed call for greater education and awareness around the issue of honor, killings and domestic violence in immigrant communities. Conclusion of Part 3. A legacy of justice and awareness. The trial of the Shafia family served as an important turning point in the fight against honor-based violence and patriarchy. While justice was ultimately served, the case underscored the need for continued efforts to combat domestic violence, support victims, and prevent future tragedies. The legacy of Zainab, Sahar, Geeti, and Rona lives on in the reforms and conversations sparked by their tragic deaths. In the final part of this series, we will explore the lasting impact of the Shafia family murders on the Canadian legal system, the awareness campaigns that followed, and the continuing fight for gender equality and the rights of women in immigrant communities. Stay tuned as we continue to unravel the Shafia family's dark story and the lessons learned from this chilling case. Part 4. The legacy of the Shafia family. Murders, gender, culture, and the fight for justice. The Shafia family murders, a horrific crime that left 4 women dead and a community in shock, left an indelible mark on Canada's legal, cultural, and societal landscape. While the case itself may have reached its legal conclusion with the conviction of Mohammad Tooba and Maxwell Shafia, the broader repercussions of the crime would continue to reverberate for years to come. The case not only shed light on the devastating impact of patriarchal control and honor-based violence, but also served as a catalyst for important conversations on gender equality, the treatment of immigrant communities, and the role of the justice system in protecting vulnerable individuals. In this final part of the series, we'll explore the legacy of the Shafia family murders, the national and international efforts that followed, and the ongoing fight for justice and change in honor-based violence cases. From legislative reforms to educational initiatives, the tragedy of these 4 women has fueled a movement that calls for societal transformation in addressing violence against women and supporting at-risk communities. The legal and societal aftermath. What changed? The convictions of the Shafia family members were a crucial moment in the pursuit of justice, but they also sparked a broader conversation about the legal system's response to gender-based violence and honor killings. The Shafia case brought these issues to the forefront in Canada, igniting a nationwide dialogue on how honor-based violence was being handled within the legal and cultural frameworks of immigrant communities. The Shafia family murders revealed how ingrained patriarchal values, particularly in some immigrant communities, could lead to horrifying acts of violence against women. For many, the deaths of Zainab, Sahar, Geerti, and Rona seemed to symbolize the larger, often hidden issue of domestic violence, where women's lives are devalued in the name of family honor. Their deaths represented a larger systemic issue that needed urgent attention from both legal and social institutions. The Shafia case also exposed gaps in the Canadian legal system when it came to addressing the complexities of honor-based violence. While Canada's laws were designed to protect individuals from violence, the question of how to approach crimes rooted in cultural practices and family control posed a significant challenge for the courts. In response to the Shafia murders and the subsequent trial, Canadian lawmakers and advocates for gender equality and immigrant rights began calling for increased efforts to educate immigrant communities about the importance of gender equality and to provide better support for women at risk of domestic violence. There was a growing understanding that traditional cultural values could not be allowed to justify violence, and that robust legal measures needed to be in place to protect individuals from being trapped in violent family dynamics. Legislative and policy changes a path toward protection and awareness. In the aftermath of the Shafia case, Canadian lawmakers and civil society groups sought to strengthen the country's legal framework and services for women who faced domestic violence, especially those from immigrant and marginalized communities. One key area of focus was the need for better access to education about the dangers of honor-based violence and the importance of supporting women who might be in vulnerable situations. Some specific policy changes and developments that emerged after the Shafia case include 1. Increased public awareness campaigns. One of the immediate consequences of the Shafia case was a surge in public awareness campaigns about domestic violence and honor killings. Government agencies, non-profits, and advocacy groups worked together to create educational programs aimed at immigrant communities in Canada. These programs focused on the rights of women, the importance of gender equality, and the recognition of abusive behaviors in relationships. Additionally, they worked to break down cultural barriers that might prevent victims of domestic violence from coming forward for help. 2. Domestic violence education and outreach. The Shafia case highlighted the importance of addressing domestic violence through targeted education and outreach, particularly in immigrant communities. These programs were designed to provide individuals, especially women, with information on how to identify abusive relationships and access resources, like shelters and hotlines. Many of these initiatives worked closely with community leaders to ensure that information about women's rights and legal protections was disseminated to those who might not otherwise have known where to seek help. 3. Legal protections for women. The Shafia murders also prompted discussions on strengthening Canada's legal protections for women, particularly in the context of family and domestic violence. Proposals were made to improve the enforcement of laws related to violence against women, such as stricter penalties for perpetrators of honor-based violence and better training for law enforcement on recognizing and addressing gender-based violence. Case also led to calls for better coordination between law enforcement, legal professionals, and social services to ensure that women facing abuse were adequately supported. This included recommendations for improved training for police officers and judges on the dynamics of domestic violence, as well as for better safeguards to prevent honor killings. 4. Integration of immigrant women into Canadian society. Another critical issue that arose from the Shafia case was the integration of immigrant women into Canadian society. Many of the victims in this case were part of an immigrant family, and their deaths highlighted the difficulties faced by immigrant women who found themselves caught between traditional cultural values and the more liberal norms of their new society. Advocacy groups called for greater efforts to ensure that immigrant women had access to resources and support networks to help them navigate these cultural and social challenges. The call for enhanced social integration was aimed at empowering immigrant women by providing them with tools to navigate Canadian society, understand their rights, and seek help when necessary. It was clear that the Shafia family murders could not be viewed solely through the lens of cultural conflict, but rather as part of a larger issue concerning gender inequality and the treatment of women in all communities. National conversation, challenging cultural norms and patriarchy. The Shafia family murders were not just about one crime or one family, they were a symbol of the larger global issue of patriarchal control and honor-based violence. The case brought the issue of women's rights in immigrant communities into the spotlight, forcing a national conversation on how Canadian society could protect vulnerable women and challenge cultural practices that promote gender inequality. For many Canadians, the Shafia case was a painful reminder of the harsh realities that women face in certain cultural and family environments. It forced a reckoning with how cultural practices and traditions could be used to justify violence against women, particularly in situations where women are seen as property or are expected to live in obedience to patriarchal authority. The case of Zainab, Sahar, Geeti, and Rona sparked a critical re-evaluation of cultural sensitivity in legal systems. While it was essential to honor cultural diversity in immigrant communities, there was also an overwhelming recognition that cultural practices that harm women must not be tolerated under the guise of tradition. The Shafia murders, in this sense, became a symbol of the fight against violence, masquerading as family or cultural honor, and a call for societies to prioritize the protection and dignity of women. The ongoing fight for women's rights, a legacy of change while justice was served with the conviction of Mohammad Tooba and Maxwell Shafia. The fight for justice for women like Zainab, Sahar, Geeti, and Rona is ongoing. The case galvanized women's rights organizations, immigrant community groups, and policymakers to continue advocating for legislative reforms, better access to resources for women, and stronger enforcement of laws protecting women from violence. 4. The families of the victims, particularly Zainab's surviving family members. The battle is not just about seeking justice for one tragedies, about preventing further tragedies from occurring. Their work in raising awareness about honor killings, domestic violence, and the importance of protecting women has become part of their enduring legacy. Through their advocacy, the memory of their daughters and sisters lives on in the fight for a more just, equal, and safe society. The international impact, a global dialogue on honor-based violence. The Shafia case also had a significant international impact, drawing attention to the issue of honor-based violence on a global scale. Canada is not alone in confronting these issues. Many countries around the world are grappling with similar concerns regarding the intersection of cultural practices and the protection of women's rights. The Shafia family murders have become part of an ongoing global dialogue about the need to balance cultural sensitivity with the imperative to protect human rights, especially those of women. The case helped to shed light on the fact that honor-based violence is not confined to one region or one culture. It is a problem that transcends borders. It forced many countries to examine their own legal frameworks, cultural attitudes, and societal values surrounding women's rights and gender equality. International organizations, including the United Nations, used the Shafia case as a call to action to improve global efforts to end honor-based violence. It has fueled global advocacy campaigns focused on raising awareness, changing policies, and increasing international cooperation to combat gender-based violence and discrimination. Conclusion. The Shafia murders, a legacy of change and reflection. Murders of Zainab, Saha, Gayati, and Rona Shafia left a permanent scar on the Canadian collective consciousness. The brutality of the crime, the patriarchal motivations behind it, and the eventual convictions of the Shafia family members shocked the nation and sparked a crucial conversation about gender-based violence, the intersection of culture and law, and the protection of women's rights. The legacy of the Shafia family murders is not just a tale of tragedy, but also one of resilience, reflection, and positive change. Through the public outcry, legal reforms, and educational efforts that followed, the case became a defining moment in the fight for justice for women, particularly those from immigrant and marginalized communities. While justice was served in the courts, the fight to prevent similar acts of violence continues in communities and governments worldwide. The story of the Shafia family murders will always remind us of the importance of standing up for the rights of women and challenging harmful cultural practices that perpetuate violence and discrimination. Through their legacy, the 4 victims' voices live on, reminding us that the fight for equality and justice is far from over, and that it is up to all of us to ensure that such tragedies never happen again. What are your thoughts on the Shafia family murders and the legacy it has left? How can societies address the issue of honor-based violence and better protect women from gender-based violence? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this case insightful, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Room 57 for more in-depth discussions on criminal cases and issues of justice, culture, and human rights. Hit the notification bell so you don't miss our latest videos. Thank you for joining us today. And remember, Room 57 will always be here to shed light on the most important and complex stories that shape our world.